The Montana wind carried the scent of pine and impending snow as Isabella Vasquez stood at the kitchen window of their modest ranch house, watching her father Don Rodrigo pace the front porch like a caged animal. His weathered hands clutched a stack of papers, bank notices, foreclosure warnings, and debt collection letters that had been arriving daily for months. "Mija, come here," Don Rodrigo called, his voice heavy with the weight of 15 years spent building a life in this unforgiving American landscape. Isabella dried her hands on her apron, the fabric worn thin from years of hard work, and stepped onto the porch where the October air bit at her cheeks. The Vasquez ranch stretched before them, 160 acres of Montana grassland that had been their sanctuary since fleeing the poverty of Jalisco, Mexico. But now, even this refuge was slipping through their fingers like sand. "The bank wants $180,000 by December 1st, Don Rodrigo said, his English still tinged with the accent of his homeland. "If we don't pay, we lose everything. The cattle, the land, our home, everything your mother and I built for you and your brothers." Isabella's heart sank. At 26, she had spent the last 4 years saving every penny from her job at the local elementary school, dreaming of completing her teaching degree. Those dreams now seemed as distant as the snow-capped peaks surrounding their valley. "Papa, maybe I can take a second job or—" "No, Mija. I found another way." Don Rodrigo's voice carried a finality that made Isabella's stomach clench. "There's a man, Jake Morrison. He owns the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. He's made us an offer." The words hung in the crisp air like a death sentence. Isabella knew her father well enough to recognize the shame in his eyes, the way he couldn't quite meet her gaze. "What kind of offer?" she whispered, though part of her already knew. "He needs a wife to fulfill the terms of his grandfather's will. Something about proving he's settled down to inherit the full estate. In exchange, he'll pay off our debts and give us enough to start fresh." Don Rodrigo finally looked at his daughter, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Isabella, I know this isn't what you wanted, but— You want me to marry a stranger?" The words came out sharper than she intended, cutting through the mountain air like a blade. "He's a good man, successful, respected in the community. And it's not forever, just until he secures his inheritance. Then you can decide what you want to do." Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The teaching position she'd been promised at Billings Elementary, the small apartment she'd been saving for, the independence she'd fought so hard to achieve, all of it crumbling like autumn leaves. "When?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The wedding is set for this Saturday. He's already made the arrangements." Saturday. 4 days away. 4 days to say goodbye to the life she'd imagined for herself. That evening, Isabella sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by textbooks and lesson plans she'd been preparing for her future students. Her younger brother Miguel knocked softly on the door. "Isabella? Can I come in?" At 19, Miguel had inherited their father's stubborn pride but their mother's gentle heart. He sat on the edge of her bed, his calloused hands, evidence of years working the ranch, fidgeting with the brim of his baseball cap. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can drop out of college, work full-time. We'll find another way." Isabella reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "And let you sacrifice your dreams too?" "No, Miguel. Someone has to break this cycle of struggle. If my sacrifice means you become the engineer you've always wanted to be, then it's worth it." But even as she spoke the words, Isabella felt a piece of her heart breaking. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that echoed the ache in her chest. The next morning brought news that Jake Morrison would be arriving Thursday to meet his bride-to-be. Don Rodrigo had described him as a man of few words, someone who preferred the company of cattle to people, and who rarely removed his cowboy hat even indoors. "He's private," Don Rodrigo explained as they prepared for the meeting. "Built his fortune from nothing just like we're trying to do. He understands what it means to fight for survival." Isabella nodded, trying to imagine a life with this mysterious stranger. Would he be kind? Would he allow her to continue teaching? Would he understand that her heart belonged to someone else? Someone who had disappeared from her life 14 years ago but had never left her thoughts? As Thursday approached, Isabella found herself standing once again at the kitchen window, watching the road that wound through their valley. Soon, a man would drive up that road and change her life forever. She just had no idea how much. Thursday morning arrived with an early frost that painted the Montana landscape in silver. Isabella had barely slept, her mind racing between memories of her childhood in Jalisco and the uncertain future that awaited her. She dressed carefully in her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit her mother had sewn for her high school graduation, and braided her long black hair with trembling fingers. At exactly 10 o'clock, the rumble of a diesel truck echoed through the valley. Isabella watched from behind the lace curtains as a massive black Ford F-350 pulled into their gravel driveway, its chrome bumpers gleaming in the morning sun. The truck spoke of wealth and success, everything their family had struggled to achieve. Don Rodrigo straightened his tie and walked outside, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. Isabella remained at the window, her heart hammering against her ribs as a tall figure emerged from the driver's seat. Jake Morrison was imposing, easily 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that filled out his denim jacket. True to her father's description, he wore a black cowboy hat pulled low over his face, casting shadows that made it impossible to see his features clearly. His movements were confident, purposeful, like a man accustomed to commanding respect. "Mr. Morrison," Don Rodrigo called out, extending his hand. "Welcome to our home, Mr. Vasquez." The voice was deep, with a slight rasp that suggested years of calling cattle across vast pastures. "Thank you for having me." Isabella strained to hear more, but their conversation was too quiet to catch from inside. She watched as her father gestured toward the house, clearly inviting Jake inside to meet her. Her palms grew sweaty as she smoothed her dress one final time. The front door opened and Don Rodrigo's voice filled the small living room. "Isabella, come meet Mr. Morrison." She entered the room with as much dignity as she could muster, her chin raised despite the turmoil in her heart. Jake Morrison stood near the fireplace, his hat still firmly in place, his hands clasped behind his back. Even with his face partially hidden, she could see the strong line of his jaw and the way he carried himself with quiet authority. "Miss Vasquez," he said, inclining his head slightly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Morrison." Isabella's voice was steadier than she felt. "My father tells me you have a proposition." Something in his posture shifted, a barely perceptible tension that she might have missed if she hadn't been studying him so intently. "I do. Perhaps we could speak privately?" Don Rodrigo nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." He disappeared, leaving Isabella alone with this stranger who held her family's fate in his hands. Jake Morrison moved to the window, his back to her as he gazed out at the struggling ranch. "Your father is a proud man," he said quietly. "I respect that. This situation, it's not easy for any of us. But it's necessary," Isabella replied, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "At least for my family." He turned slightly, though his face remained shadowed. "And for me as well. My grandfather's will is specific. I need to be married within 6 months of his death to inherit the full estate. Without it, everything he built will be sold to pay estate taxes. So we're both trapped by the expectations of our families," Isabella observed. "Perhaps. Or perhaps we're both fighting for something worth preserving." He paused, and she thought she heard something familiar in his tone, a warmth that seemed at odds with his imposing presence. "I want you to know, Miss Vasquez, that this arrangement doesn't have to be traditional. You would have your own space, your freedom to pursue your teaching career. I'm not looking for a wife in the conventional sense, just a partner in preserving what our families have built." Isabella felt a flicker of hope. "You would let me continue teaching?" "I would insist on it. A mind like yours shouldn't be wasted." Again, that strange familiarity in his voice, as if he knew more about her than their brief introduction should have revealed. They talked for another hour, discussing practical arrangements, living situations, and the timeline for their unusual marriage. Throughout the conversation, Jake Morrison remained courteous but distant, never removing his hat, never allowing her to see his face clearly. Yet something about him nagged at Isabella, The way he held his head when he listened, the gentle tone he used when speaking about her dreams, the careful way he avoided looking directly at her. As he prepared to leave, Jake paused at the door. "Miss Vasquez. Isabella. I know this isn't the life you planned. But I promise you I'll do everything in my power to make sure you don't regret this decision." After he left, Isabella sat in the empty living room, staring at the spot where he had stood. There had been something in his voice when he said her name, a tenderness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere politeness. But that was impossible. He was a stranger, a successful rancher who needed a wife for business purposes. Nothing more. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind howl through the mountains, Isabella found herself thinking not of Jake Morrison, but of Santiago Morales, the boy who had been her best friend, her first love, her first heartbreak. Somewhere out there, he was living his own life, probably married with children, having long forgotten the little girl who had cried for weeks after he disappeared. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine her wedding day just 2 days away. She would walk down the aisle of the small church in town, wearing her mother's wedding dress, and marry a man whose face she had never fully seen. It felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. But as sleep finally claimed her, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that Jake Morrison was hiding more than just his face beneath that black cowboy hat. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with a kind of crystalline Montana sky that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Isabella stood before the mirror in the small church vestry, adjusting her mother's wedding dress for the final time. The ivory lace had yellowed slightly with age, but it still fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 27 years for this moment. Her hands shook as she fastened the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, something old, something borrowed. The something blue was a small ribbon tied around her bouquet of wildflowers that Miguel had picked from their property that morning. "You look beautiful, Mija," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Like an angel." Isabella managed a weak smile. "I just wish Abuela could see this." "She can," her mother assured her, squeezing her hands. "And she's proud of the sacrifice you're making for our family." Through the vestry window, Isabella could see the small gathering of guests, mostly family friends from the Mexican community and a few of Jake's business associates. It was a modest affair, nothing like the wedding she had dreamed of as a little girl. But then again, nothing about this day was as she had imagined. The church door opened, and Don Rodrigo appeared in his best suit, his face a mixture of pride and guilt. "It's time, Mija." Isabella took a deep breath, picked up her bouquet, and followed her father to the back of the church. The organ began playing the traditional wedding march, and the small congregation rose to their feet. At the altar, she could see Jake Morrison waiting, his back straight, his black cowboy hat still firmly in place. As she walked down the aisle, Isabella's mind drifted to another time, another place. She remembered being 12 years old, walking through the dusty streets of her village in Jalisco with Santiago Morales, talking about their dreams for the future. He had promised they would always be together, that nothing could separate them. How naive they had been. The ceremony began with Father Martinez speaking in both English and Spanish, honoring both cultures represented in this union. Isabella responded to the vows mechanically, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. Beside her, Jake's responses were equally measured, professional. "Do you, Isabella Vasquez, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "Do you, Jake Morrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was softer now, filled with an emotion she couldn't identify. "You may now kiss the bride." This was the moment Isabella had been dreading. Jake Morrison turned to face her and slowly, so slowly it felt like time had stopped, he reached up and removed his black cowboy hat. The world tilted. Dark hair, slightly longer than she remembered. The same strong jawline, now shadowed with stubble. Eyes the color of rich coffee, eyes that had haunted her dreams for 14 years. A small scar above his left eyebrow from the time he fell out of the mango tree in her grandmother's yard. Santiago. The name escaped her lips as a breathless whisper. "Hola, Isabella," he said softly, his voice breaking slightly on her name. "I told you I'd find you again." The church seemed to spin around her. Gasps echoed from the congregation as they witnessed this unexpected reunion. Isabella's bouquet fell from her numb fingers, scattering wildflowers across the altar steps. You're? She couldn't form the words, couldn't process what she was seeing. I'm sorry, Santiago, Jake whispered, his eyes never leaving her face. I'm so sorry for everything. 14 years of pain, longing, and unanswered questions crashed over Isabella like a tidal wave. The boy who had been ripped from her life during that terrible night when immigration officers raided their neighborhood. The boy she had loved with all the fierce intensity of first love. The boy who had vanished without a trace, leaving her to wonder if he was alive or dead. You left me, she said, her voice growing stronger, anger beginning to override shock. You disappeared and never came back. Never sent word. I thought you were dead. Isabella, please let me explain. Explain? Her voice rose, echoing through the small church. Explain how you became Jake Morrison? How you got rich while my family struggled? How you orchestrated this whole charade instead of just coming to me? The congregation watched in stunned silence as years of suppressed emotion poured out of Isabella. Santiago reached for her hand, but she jerked away. I looked for you, she continued, tears streaming down her face. For years I looked for you. I asked everyone, searched every database, prayed every night that you would come back. And all this time you were here? In Montana? Living as someone else. Isabella, por favor? No. She stepped back, her wedding dress rustling against the altar steps. You don't get to por favor me. You don't get to show up on my wedding day, our wedding day, and expect me to just fall into your arms like nothing happened. Father Martinez cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should finish the ceremony, Isabella said firmly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. We have a contract to fulfill, don't we, Mr. Morrison? Santiago's face crumpled with pain. Isabella, please don't do this. Let me explain what happened that night, how I ended up here, why I... Later, she said coldly. Right now we have an audience and a legal obligation. So let's finish what we started. With shaking hands, Santiago placed the simple gold band on Isabella's finger. She did the same for him, her touch as impersonal as she could make it. When Father Martinez pronounced them husband and wife, Santiago leaned in to kiss her, but Isabella turned her head at the last moment, offering only her cheek. As they walked back down the aisle together, Isabella's mind raced. The boy she had loved was alive, was here, was now her husband. But he was also the man who had let her believe he was dead for 14 years. The man who had built a new life while she mourned the loss of their shared dreams. Outside the church, as rice and flower petals rained down on them, Isabella looked up at the man she had just married, this stranger who wore the face of her first love. We need to talk, she said quietly. Yes, Santiago agreed, his eyes filled with a pain that matched her own. We have 14 years to catch up on. But as they climbed into his truck to drive to their new life together, Isabella wondered if some wounds were too deep to heal, and if some loves were too broken to mend. The drive to Santiago's ranch passed in tense silence. When they arrived at the magnificent Morrison Ranch, a sprawling log mansion against the Montana foothills, Isabella was stunned by its grandeur. But what truly shocked her were the photographs throughout the house. Images of their childhood village, their old school, and prominently displayed on the mantelpiece, a faded photo of them at age 12, arms around each other. You kept this? Isabella whispered. I kept everything, Santiago said softly. Every memory was all I had for 14 years. Sitting in the living room, Santiago finally told his story. That night during the immigration raid, I was trying to reach your house when agents grabbed me. They put me in detention for 3 months, then the Morrisons adopted me and brought me here. I became Jake Morrison, but I never stopped looking for you. Isabella's anger began to soften as she understood his pain. I thought you were dead, she whispered. When I turned 18, I hired investigators. It took years to find you through the Mexican-American community. When I learned your family was in trouble, I couldn't just show up. What if you had moved on? So I created this arrangement, hoping to help your family first, then reveal who I was. Isabella walked to the window looking out at the vast ranch. You became everything we dreamed about as children. But none of it meant anything without you, Santiago replied, moving behind her. Every success was just trying to fill the hole you left in my life. She turned to face him. I never stopped loving you either. Even when I hated you for leaving. Santiago gently cupped her face. Isabella, mi amor, I know 14 years is a long time and we're different people now. But if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost. We can't go back, she said softly. But maybe we can build something new. I want to keep teaching, Isabella said finally. Of course. And I want to take things slowly. We need time to learn who we've become. All the time you need, Santiago promised. As the Montana sun set, Isabella and Santiago sat on their porch, talking through the night, sharing 14 years of separate lives. They had years of hurt to heal and trust to rebuild, but as dawn broke over the mountains, Isabella knew that some loves are strong enough to survive any distance or time. Their childhood promise had finally been kept. They were together again, and this time nothing would separate them.